Coming to paperback and e-readers from SJS Direct, Isis, House of Isis, the goddess next door takes on a hustling Hotep high priestess in Harlem in this Afrocentric Isis series adventure. Pre-order Isis, House of Isis on Amazon.com today. In a recent interview, writer Christopher Preist, author of comic books like Batman, Spider-Man, Deadpool, and Black Panther, talked about the racial obstacles he ran into as he worked in the comic book industry. And he talked about how almost every 18 months, an editor at Marvel or DC would come to him proposing a series featuring only an African American character. And Christopher Priest took a lot of offense to that, and oftentimes he would pass on these projects because he believed he was going to be pigeonholed into just writing black characters. Now, I've been well aware of Christopher Priest's career ever since he was Jim Owsley and he was writing Batman back in the 80s, and he wrote classics like Spider-Man vs. Wolverine back in 1987. So I'm well aware of Christopher Priest's writing background as a comic book writer, and to say that he should only write black characters, that's really offensive, because when I look at Christopher Priest's work on Spider-Man and Batman, it clearly shows me he knows how to write great characters regardless of the color of their skin, because he's focusing on the content of their character. And as I see it, if you are a great writer, what you're going to do is just write great stories, because this fact that he admits in his statement in the interview that writers write is something that legendary screenplay writer Sid Field wrote in his book Screenplay. He said in his screenplay book that writers write, actors act, and directors direct. And that's how it worked in Hollywood with making movies. The writer's job is to just write the story. His job as a writer is to open up your imagination so that you can see these pictures in your mind come to life and see these characters as people who are just as real as you and I are right now. That's the job of a good writer. A good writer is not really focusing on the color of a character's skin when they first start writing a character. I know this for a fact because I have been writing for over 25 years, and oftentimes when I write characters, I am more focused on the character's personality, the character's voice, and the character's look than the color of their skin. When I go out here and I write characters like a Matilda Crowley for a book like a Spinsterella, I'm more focused on what her voice is going to sound like when I'm writing in a first-person narrative, because I know that's the first thing that the reader is going to pick up on when they read the story. The first thing they're going to pick up on is, what does this person sound like in their narration, and what do they sound like in dialogue? That's the first thing they're going to pick up on in a story. The second thing they're going to want to know about is, what type of clothes do they wear? What do they look like? And that's something I focus on the second aspect of creating a character. When I'm focusing on a character, I'm oftentimes looking in catalogs like a Victoria's Secret or J. Crew or a Brooks Brothers or any other fashion catalog, and just thinking about what they look like and what type of clothes they would wear. And I'm also thinking about what type of interests and hobbies they'd have, what type of music they listen to, what type of food do they like to eat, all sorts of aspects as related to creating a person come to life in the reader's imagination. Because when I write stories, I often see it in my head like a movie going on, or like panels of a comic book, and I want to take the reader into that world by just using my words. And that's part of what a writer's job is. Part of their job is making sure that their words convey that picture in a person's mind. Now, the last thing I think about whenever I'm writing a character is the character's ethnicity, because the character's ethnicity really isn't the most important part of it for me, even though I make every effort to write positive African American characters. I'm often focused on the content of their character not the color of their skin when I'm developing a character. Usually, that character's ethnicity is usually like the last part of developing that character, because there were a couple of character concepts where I just started off on something simple like a name or a voice or a personality aspect of a character. Like when I was writing Nikki Desmond, who was all for the All About Nikki screenplays that I was writing, that entire first season of screenplays I wrote, I often focused on making sure that her voice sounded like one of these California Valley girls who was very elitist. And when I would do the gags at the dinner table, I would do them in a lot of laughs because that's what I was focusing on. Primarily, I wanted to make sure that the character's voice conveyed what this character acted and sounded like. And when I was doing the Matilda Crowley character, I wanted this goth character to have a bit of a certain type of voice where she sounded a certain way, where she would use the dude phrase and speak in a certain phrase. And oftentimes my readers would pick up on it, and I had one reader tell me that Matilda Crowley sounded just like Paula Patton, and then I went over and I watched a Paula Patton interview, and Paula Patton sounded just like Matilda Crowley. It was just like an eerie coincidence, but that's what they picked up on when they read the story. The first thing they picked up on was the character's voice. So I understand what Christopher Preist was talking about when he talked about writers write. Because when I write stories, again, I focus on those internal character traits first, because I know that's what's going to connect the reader to the character and make the character relatable to them. They want to see those internal character traits come out of the character and be conveyed to them. They want to see that personality come to life, and they want to hear that voice, and it's that voice that allows us to really connect something to the visual aspects. And with comic book writing, the character's voice is extremely important, because that's something that people are going to pick up on automatically as they read from panel to panel. I remember back in the day reading old X-Men comics and just imagining what Cyclops sounded like, imagining what Wolverine sounded like. And then when the X-Men cartoon came on in 1992, they literally got it absolutely right as related to what was in my imagination. Cyclops sounded very straight-laced. Wolverine sounded very brusque and very hard. Storm, she had this British accent. And it all came to life based on what was written on the page. Most of these modern day SJW writers, they often try to focus on the character's ethnicity first, and that leads to a very, very flat and very one-dimensional type character, because when you focus on a character's ethnicity first, you're really not going to be able to create that character that comes to life in the reader's imagination, because what you're going to do is you're going to pigeonhole yourself into a box, and all you're going to see are people as related to stereotypes. And that's what happens when you call yourself writing just an ethnicity. You go by what you think you know about something instead of trying to write about something from research. And this is another point that Christopher Preist made that I can agree with, in that you can write anything if you do research. When I first started writing ISIS, I didn't know that much about Egyptian mythology, but over the years, I did more and more research on the Egyptian gods. I did more and more research on Egyptian mythology, and I learned all about the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian mythology as I wrote the first ISIS back in 1999, and later on in 2012 as I began writing the ISIS series. And when it comes down to other books like Spinsterella, Spellbound, and the legendary Mad Matilda, I had to do extensive research on the goth subculture in order for me to write a story about an African American goth. And I literally did almost 3 to 4 years of research just learning more about the goth subculture. Now, I knew a few things of the goth subculture, but I learned in depth about the goth subculture from all the goths on YouTube and all the goths online, and they showed me the humanity of a person in the goth subculture and showed me the life experiences of people in the goth subculture all over the world. So, in order for me to be able to write a goth character, I needed to learn about the goth subculture. And sometimes when I'm writing ISIS series books like ISIS, All About the Goddess, I wanted to write a story where ISIS was going undercover as this art model at a college, and I had to go out and do research on a college like the New School here in New York, and I also had to do extensive research on art modeling and art models. And I sat down and I read a whole bunch of websites, and I had some information from my previous book, All About Maryland, I had used regarding art models, and I even listened to other art models talk about their experience by watching YouTube videos. So I used all that research to write Isis All About the Goddess and talk about art modeling and what they were paid, what they were compensated, what it was like to be an art model, what the experience was. And I wrote all of that based on research. And that is one of the better selling ISIS series stories in the ISIS series. And it is sold all over the world. And it's a book that not only features Isis, who is a black superheroine, but it also features her interacting with people from all over the world, whether they white people and other people. And that book, again, was one of the better selling ISIS series books. And that book was done primarily through research. I never went to an art modeling class, but I did research on it, and I was able to write a story that resonated with readers all over the world. And that's something, again, I can agree with Christopher Preist on, because I have to do extensive research, and a writer can write if given the time to do research on a subject. They can literally take you into a world, or they can take you into a time, like I did with Spellbound. When I wrote Spellbound, I went back to the year of 1989, and I did extensive research on the year of 1989 and 1989 as related to the goth subculture, not just my own personal experiences, but I went on my own research that I had picked up online and from people in that time. And I also did research on the fashions of the time, I did research on the clothes of the time, and I did research on the goth subculture of 1989. And again, when I did that book Spellbound, it got an extremely positive response because of all the research that I did on that book. And I did another book called ISIS Imitation of Life, which I'm still trying to get the money to pay for the cover so I can get that book released. And that book was written about the period of 1937. Now, I wasn't born in the year of 1937, but a lot of people read that story and say that I did a great job on that period of 1937. I gave it to some beta readers, and they liked it, and they liked the way I conveyed life for an African American in 1937. And I'm doing a new book called Esteem, the Sands of Time, and that's a book set in ancient Egypt. So I did the research for that one about Egyptian priests and priestesses, and I did research on ancient Egypt in the early days and the Pharaoh, and I did research on Isis and Osiris, and all of that I put into this time travel story, and that again proves Christopher Priest's point that it's all about a writer just doing their research and they can put together a great story. And when I write characters, I oftentimes go from research and I make efforts to learn about certain things to make sure that the voice comes to life. Like for the Spinsterella trilogy, one of the characters I wrote, Matilda's father, is a white man, and I was inspired to write the Jason Crowley character based on what I heard from Tommy Lee Jones's voice. Now, in order for me to understand Tommy Lee Jones's voice, I have to go and watch movies that feature Tommy Lee Jones. So I do that so that when the reader reads the character off the page, they literally hear Tommy Lee Jones's voice in their head. And for other characters, like the Esteem character, I would go out and watch movies featuring actress Sally Richardson Whitfield. And in order for me to write that character, I had to watch a lot of movies to pick up her speech pattern so that Easting would sound like Sally Richardson in the narration and in the dialogue. And for the Osiris character, I would go out and watch movies featuring Samuel L. Jackson because I wanted Samuel L. Jackson to be Osiris in my imagination. So I would go out and listen to Samuel L. Jackson speak, and I would get that voice and put it in the story. And people, when they read Isis stories that featured Osiris, he would sound just like Samuel L. Jackson. People would say that Osiris sounds just like Samuel L. Jackson, and that was due to me just listening to Samuel L. Jackson's speech pattern, and that's something a writer does as part of their story in trying to capture a voice. Is they want to make sure that you hear certain things as listening to the voice, you see certain things as related to an imagination, and you see certain things as related to imagery. And you know that you're doing things right when people see what you're trying to imagine. And I had guy Run.exe, he saw what I saw with Matilda Crowley when he did a digital piece of art featuring Matilda Crowley, and it literally looked like it came out of something in my imagination. That's how I would have imagined Matilda Crowley to look like, and he literally did that in a piece of fan art, and the fan art was so good I just had to feature it on the cover because it literally was like something taken straight out of my imagination featuring the Matilda Crowley character. But a good writer, when they're really good, they can make that image appear in your mind, they can make that story come to life, and they can make you see what they're trying to draw in your mind. And that's the way I see it as related to writing, because when writers write, their job is to open up your imagination and literally make it like there's a movie going on in your mind. And that's something that is done so that you can see these characters come to life. And usually when these writers go out here, like these SJW writers at Marvel, and they go out of their way to try to make a character a certain ethnicity, what they really do is they limit their imagination, they limit their creativity, and then they wind up pigeonholing people into stereotypes, and that prevents us from really seeing a rich, multidimensional character. And this is why their comics usually are just of such poor quality, is we don't see this person come to life. We see a bunch of ideas regarding an ethnic group, and that really leads to a really flat and one-dimensional reading experience. Whereas a writer who focuses on character first, you start to see this person come to life. That's why I always talk about the whole concept of writing a character who is black, not a black character. Because when people write a character who is black, they are seeing the content of their character first and not the color of their skin. Whereas a person who writes a black character, what happens is they see their skin color first and then their character second. And then what happens is we wind up with this character who is really flat and uninspired. Now, I grew up in the age of black superheroes and comic book characters like Jim Rhodes, Cyborg, and many other characters who were well crafted. I mean, I think about the work that was done on Cyborg and Jim Rhodes, and those are multidimensional characters who are black. When I think about poorly done black characters, I think about the early days of the Falcon, and it wasn't really well developed. When I think about, because he's really two-dimensional when you compare him to Jim Rhodes. Falcon is not as well developed as Jim Rhodes is, or the way that Cyborg was, and he's not as well developed as Christopher Preist did with Black Panther. When Christopher Preist took a hold of Black Panther, he gave him a lot more depth and layers than previous writers did. So he did a great job in giving us that. And again, it's all due to his approach, and his approach is the exact same approach that the legendary Sid Field talked about in his book, Screenplay. In Screenplay, Sid Field said that writers write, and good writers, like myself and many others out here, when we focus on writing a story, we often focus on the content of a character first, then we focus on the color of their skin, And that's how we make a character that can resonate with readers for years on end. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct characters like Isis, John Haynes, and Eve Steam, you can do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me pay for the covers for the SJS Direct 2018 catalog, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.